Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 56. Well, stay tuned for more Kingdom Prologue, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's good to be back with you again.
I think I just love Kingdom Prologue because every week now I'm excited to have our discussion. But
I know. Isn't Kingdom Prologue great?
It is. And not to take anything away from his other books, but this one really is the gem, I think.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree.
I will just quickly run through our regular housekeeping so that we can get to that discussion. Please remember, dear listener, that we have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. We continue to be thankful for your ratings on iTunes and your subscriptions. Please continue to encourage others that you know to rate us and to subscribe on their favorite podcatcher. Thank you to those of you who are donating to help us keep the podcast going. Lee and I are not keeping any of that money for ourselves. It's going right into the monthly cost of hosting the audio files. If you would like to donate, if you have the means to do that, there is a donate button on the right-hand side of the page at meredithkline.com/podcast. And I'd like to invite any listeners who have not joined us in the Meredith Kline Facebook group to do so. We really enjoy interacting with our listeners there. I think that's it for housekeeping. Is there anything else, Lee?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. In that case, we are picking up at the very end of chapter 1 with a section called Sabbath and Consecration. We ended with a bit of a Sabbath discussion last episode, and today we are picking up on page 38 with Sabbath and Consecration.
Yeah, so in the previous section, Kline had been giving a number of arguments from the text as well as other passages of Scripture to argue that when God rested on the seventh day, that should be understood as a royal enthronement. And so God is enthroned over all of creation as Lord of creation. So it's his, the picture is God is taking his seat on his throne in the cosmic temple and taking up his place of lordship over all of creation. But now in this section called Sabbath and Consecration, Kline continues that thought, but brings out another dimension of it, which is this idea of the hierarchical pattern of dominion that you can see in the creation account. Again, this supports the idea that God is enthroned as the king on the seventh day. But here he's looking at the other 6 days and showing how those other 6 days sort of prepare the way for the seventh day. And he appeals to his well-known framework interpretation of the Genesis week, in which the 6 days of creation can be divided into 2 triads. So the first triad, days 1, 2, and 3, talks about the establishment of the creation kingdoms or the spheres of creation. So, for example, day 1 creates the light. So you have the sphere of light and darkness. Then on day 2, you have the separation of the waters above the firmament from the waters below. So you have the sky and the seas. And then day 3 is the separation of the dry land from the seas. So you have the sphere of the dry land. And you also have the creation of vegetation to grow on the dry land. Then in days 4 through 6, you have the creature kings that God appoints to rule over each of those kingdoms. So on day 4, he creates the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they are given dominion over the light of day 1. On day 5, you have the sea creatures and the winged creatures who are given dominion over the the sky and the seas of day 2. And then on day 6, you have the land animals and man. The land animals are given dominion over the dry land. And man is given dominion over all of the spheres and all of the creature kings up to that point. And so that then leads to a hierarchy. So you have this idea of an ascending hierarchy of dominion, the lower creation, and then man himself is the vassal king under God, the great king, and he is subordinate to the great king on day 7 when God takes up his Sabbath rest.
So we have kingdoms, we have kings over those kingdoms, and then ultimately God himself. And I mean, we can see in the text that the word rule is used, right?
Mm-hmm.
God gave the rulers in days 4, 5, and 6 explicitly with the verb to rule over the respective kingdoms from days 1, 2, and 3. I know that we don't find this exact language in Genesis chapter 1, but it reminds me of, I think it was Mark Futato who argued in his journal article about the framework interpretation that there's in chapter 2, is it verse 5, a twofold problem and a twofold solution. And we're seeing sort of the same pattern here in chapter 1. There was no kingdom and there was no king to rule over the kingdom. And so God solved both of those quote unquote problems by creating the kingdoms and then by creating the kings to rule over those kingdoms.
Yeah. Are you referring to Genesis 1:2 where it says the earth was without form and void? So without form, that's solved in days 1, 2, and 3, where God creates the different spheres or kingdoms. And then without the earth was void, meaning there was no one it was empty. There was no one there to populate those spheres. And so days 4, 5, and 6 are the creation of the population that rules over each of those spheres.
Right. So yeah, I guess we could see Genesis 1:2 as a parallel to 2:5.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And also, just to point out, the word rule is used on day 4 with regard to the luminaries. God made the 2 great lights. This is verse 16. The greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And again in verse 18, to rule over the day and over the night. So it's clear that at least with days 1 and 4, there's a strong connection between those two. The luminaries are ruling over the sphere, the 2 spheres of light and darkness created on day 1. Now with day 5, let the waters swarm with living creatures and let the birds fly. It doesn't use the verb rule per se, but it does use similar language. It says, verse 22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the seas and let the birds multiply on the earth. And so that is a dominion mandate to be fruitful and multiply, similar to the dominion mandate given to man. And so we can infer from that the concept of rule is implied.
Okay.
But then the word comes back up again with man on day 6. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth.
Yeah, I think that last phrase there, over all the earth, is important because it's not one particular domain like any of the lesser creature kings. We really see Adam and Eve's vice-regency, using God's authority that he's given them to rule over the entire creation.
Yeah. Yeah, the word you just used, vicegerency, is an interesting one because you find it spelled both ways. Sometimes it's vicegerency or vicegerent, and sometimes it's spelled vice-regency or vice-regent. I don't know. It's an interesting way that the English language works there, but it means the same thing. Right. A sub-ruler under the great ruler.
And I'd just like to point out to our listeners that Lee has written a helpful article about the framework interpretation, which really stands behind what Kline is doing here with his argument about the consecration of lower creatures in creation to higher creatures, ultimately with everything being consecrated to God himself. Lee, you wrote that for the Ordained Servant?
Yes, in the January 2000 issue.
So just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So we'll link to that in the show notes page.
Yeah, and it has a nice little table there showing the two triads in a tabular form, so you can see the parallels.
Excellent.
Between the two triads.
Okay.
I got to share with you this great quote from Kline on page 39. This is just Kline in his poetic way of talking. It's just so great. He says, so he's describing this chain of command from the creature kingdoms to the creature kings that rule over each of those kingdoms to God, the creator king. And then he says this, and then when the creation apocalypse has reached the vicegerency of God, of the godlike creature king of the sixth day, so that's man, and moves beyond it, we observe the glory of all the creature kingdoms of all 6 days being carried along as a tributary offering within the gates of the Sabbath day to be laid at the feet of the creator king, now beheld in the brilliance of his epiphany as Sabbath Lord.
Wow. That is classic Kline.
Yeah. Just the imagery there, you know, of the gates of the Sabbath and how man is sort of bringing all the lower realms of creation as a tributary offering and bringing them within the gates of the Sabbath and laying them at the feet of the Creator King. And that ties in, actually, this kind of goes now to the next point, ties in with Kline's concept of what does the Sabbath mean for man? So in the previous episode, we were talking about what the Sabbath meant for God, you know, that God is enthroned as Lord over all creation when he rests and takes his seat upon the throne. But here now, Kline is looking at what it means for man. So just remind ourselves here of what it says. Genesis 2, verse 2 is God's part. It says, and on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So that's God's Sabbath enthronement. But then verse 3, it turns to man. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So Kline argues that in verse 3, it's not talking about God's Sabbath rest now. Now it's turning to the Sabbath ordinance that God gave man to observe. And he gets that implication from the word blessed. Whenever God blesses something in creation, he's blessing it for man's use and man's observation. So God blesses the seventh day and made it holy for man to observe. So now what he's saying is that man's observance of the Sabbath ordinance is, in effect, his way of confessing that Yahweh is Lord, because God is just rest on the seventh day. So when man imitates God, he is confessing that God is Lord. And that means that all of the work that Adam has been doing, so just as God worked for 6 days and rest on the seventh, now he's giving man a mandate to work for 6 days and rest on the seventh, so that all of the work that man does in his cultural mandate and exercising dominion over the lower creation is then brought to God. And so it goes back to that quote. It's carried along as a tributary offering within the gates of the Sabbath day and laid at the feet of God, the Creator King.
Okay. So yeah, we get that explicitly in another sentence there on page 39. Kline says, Sabbath keeping expresses man's commitment to the service of his Lord, which just sums up what you really helpfully explained there.
Yeah. Man is he's consecrating himself to God. The Sabbath is holy, so he's consecrating himself to God, but he's also consecrating all of the rest of creation that is under the vicegerency of Adam, and he is consecrating it to the Lord as well.
It's that same authority principle that Kline was talking about in By Oath Consigned.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. God is the great king, and Adam is a vassal king under God.
And whatever belongs to the vassal king, by extension, belongs to God.
Right.
So, okay. Anything else that we should say before we move into chapter 2?
I think that covers it there.
Okay. So chapter 2 is Holy Theocratic Kingdom. And so now we get to talk about theocracy and cover some of the material that we talked about in Images of the Spirit, because we're going to talk about God making man in his own image. And so Kline goes back again to some of the ancient Near Eastern treaty forms to launch this chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you recall, he said at the beginning of this major section of the book, this is on page 22, at the beginning of chapter 1, he says that the ancient vassal treaties had these 5 major sections, so he's going to use those sections as his outline for the covenant of creation. So the first section is the identification of the great king. So chapter 1 was called Lord of the Covenant Kingdom, and looking at God's name, looking at the fact that God is the creator and the consummator. Now we're moving to chapter 2, and this chapter, called the Holy Theocratic Kingdom, corresponds to the historical prologue section of the ancient Near Eastern treaty. And the historical prologue section of the ancient Near Eastern treaty form is intended to review the kindness of the great king to the vassal in previous interactions, or maybe to the vassal's father, and saying, look, I took care of your father, I protected him, and so you should therefore be loyal to me. So the purpose of this chapter then, chapter 2, is to show, I'm quoting here from page 42, to show how man's covenantal devotion was constrained by the claims of the Creator's goodness.
Okay.
So covenantal devotion will be dealt with next in chapter 3, when we get into the actual stipulations of the covenant, the law of the creation theocracy, and how man is to imitate God and to serve God and to obey God, and how there's a probation and all of that. But chapter 2 is how man's covenantal devotion that we'll look at in chapter 3 was constrained by the claims of the Creator's goodness. And so this chapter is focusing on all the goodness of God toward man at creation.
Okay. And the first thing that Kline sees in that regard is God's investment of his human creatures with his image, and he uses the term royal investment. So I guess bound up with being an image child of God is also this being a king like God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so king and kingship go together. So this chapter is talking about how God made man to be a king, a vassal king, a royal king, and then how he also endowed Adam with God's holy kingdom. So king and kingdom go hand in hand. But let's look first at that first point that Kline calls the royal investment as image son.
Okay. So
here he launches into a lot of the stuff that we talked about in Images of the Spirit. And that is, Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, etc. So the fact that Adam is made in God's image here is obvious. No one can dispute that. But what Kline wants to point out is that it's a royal image. And he gets that from the fact that you have this let us plural, the deliberative plural, let us, which Kline argues is a reference to the divine council. And the divine council, of course, is picturing God as the great king enthroned in the midst of his heavenly court with the angels as his advisors or counselors. And so if the let us is God in that judicial royal court saying, let us make man in our image, then that implies that the image partakes of that same royal and judicial aspect of the divine council. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. He also talks about, he focuses on Genesis 2:7, and that it's the breath of God, or another way that same word ruach can be rendered as the spirit, is what makes man a living soul or a living being. So that's involved in being made in the image of God.
Well, his argument there is that you see a reference to the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the spirit is the glory spirit, which is very closely connected with the divine council. So if God breathes into man's nostrils the breath of life, and that's the glory spirit doing that, then once again you have this idea of the divine council or the royal judicial aspect being closely connected with the creation of man. Here it doesn't mention that he's in the image of God, but at least it's the very intimate aspect of God creating man, and so that he becomes a living soul.
Right. In a way that we just don't see with any of the other creatures. God's not breathing life into cattle or anything like that.
Right.
Kline also appeals to the Bible describing us as temples of the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And he also reiterates those three aspects of the image of God that we talked about when we went through images of the Spirit, that I just find so fascinating and helpful. That there is an official aspect in which we image the glory spirit by being, in this case, what we're looking at here, vice kings under God. There's an ethical aspect of our imaging of the glory spirit, which Adam lost for us, but is being renewed in us by the work of the Holy Spirit as he conforms us to the image of Christ. And then finally, what seems unique to Kline's analysis that I just don't read in many other theologians is this physical or visual aspect of our imaging of the glory spirit.
Right. Yeah. All three aspects are clearly there in the text. You know, the official aspect is clear because he says, let them have dominion. The ethical aspect is clear because he is like God in righteousness and holiness, and must continue in that righteousness and advance in it. And then there's the physical and the visual aspect, that man's own body is a reflection of the glory spirit. And so there's also within that an eschatological hope that man's body would be glorified and that we would move from glory unto glory. It's an amazing thing.
It is. It makes me eager to see what the new creation is going to be like.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and, in that regard, just briefly, I always found it helpful when Kline would appeal to the resurrected Christ for our knowledge of what that would be like.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and also the transfiguration of Christ, which is a foretaste of the resurrection of Christ. But it's even, more amazing there because you see the bright cloud overshadowing him, and then his face is as brighter than the sun, and his clothes are as white as light. It's incredible.
It is.
And that's what we will one day achieve as well. not by our own strength or our own merit, but through our union with Christ, and we will be transformed into his image. But all of this, amazingly, is already packed into the very beginning, before the fall, back in Genesis 1 and 2, at least as a hope. It's an eschatological advancement that is held out to Adam as a hope. If he had passed the probation, he would have been confirmed in righteousness, and then eventually he would have been glorified, just like the transfigured Christ.
Right. It reminds me of Voss's analogy of the seed that eventually grows into the fruit-bearing tree in his inaugural address about biblical theology. And here we have all of the DNA of what's ultimately coming in the new heavens and the new earth, like you said, packed into these first few chapters in Genesis.
I like that analogy of DNA because you can't quite see it all yet, right? It's all in a very condensed and compact and unfulfilled, not yet flowered form, but it's there. It's all packed in there, and it's going to open up and come into view later on. Another thing, too, to just mention here is that this is all under the title of spirit paradigm of the image. So what Kline is arguing is this, in this, a couple of three paragraphs here at the bottom of page 42 and on to page 43 is just basically, look, all these things that you see about man, the three aspects of the image, the official dominion aspect, the ethical aspect, and the physical aspect, these are all modeled on the glory spirit. The glory spirit is the paradigm. And so man is a reflection or an ectype, and the glory spirit is the archetype. The glory spirit is the paradigm, man is the model, or the image that's based upon the model.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and there's just different language that we can try to use to describe this, like archetype and ectype, although that's not part of our everyday language. Paradigm, blueprint. The point of all of it being that we are like God in some important ways, but we are not identical to God. I mean, just completely different beings.
Yeah. And don't forget also, just to remind people that the Spirit is clearly, explicitly present in this text from the very beginning. In verse 2, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And you just sort of have this picture, right, of it's almost like some kind of a science fiction image of like this UFO hovering over, the waters, and then it's like replicating itself. And so that's what's happening here.
Do you get the sense that we're doing the best we can with the English language to say something about this, but I mean, we've already bumped up against the limits of that? Because like you're saying, I mean, we've got this image, but it's hard to, it would be hard to paint it. We're doing
the Bible is full of images, and these metaphors and analogies and images are intended to communicate truth, but obviously they're just metaphors. So
right. Okay. Well, that moves us into, so you were just talking about section A being the spirit paradigm of the image. Section B is the glory of the Imago Dei.
Yeah, so here in this section, Kline is just continuing on to, talk about the image of God, Imago Dei in Latin, and he's focusing really on this idea of the official aspect, I think. That's the sense I get. There is, he'll at the very end of this section, he'll tie it all together with the ethical and the physical aspect as well. But really in this section, he's focusing on the official or the dominion aspect. He says, man is made with the glory of an official dominion that has promise ultimately of a perfected manifestation in the luminosity of human glorification. So even that third aspect of the glorification, when the image of God is fulfilled in bodily glorification, even that has a dominion aspect to it. Because it's really, if you think about it, when man has a glorified body, that's when he can enjoy his greatest dominion over the physical creation.
Exactly. Right now, we're dependent on the technology that we build and develop to traverse this creation.
Yeah, we can exercise some degree of dominion by building houses and vehicles and even, ways of traveling into space.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the degree of dominion that God intended us to have. It's limited, just in terms of pure spatial connection and the ability to travel. We can't really go into outer space. We can't really go underneath the ocean for very long without having some kind of life support system. But in glorification, we'll be able to transcend some of those limitations and exercise the official aspect of the image of God in a much fuller way.
Which just makes me hungry to get to that point of Kingdom Prologue where we talk about Metapolis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we're not there yet.
We'll get there. So he's continuing to talk about the dominion of man over creation. He says man's dominion over the world images the dominion of the God King enthroned in the divine council of the glory temple. Man is like a little king. God is the great king, and he has dominion over all of creation, absolute dominion. But man's dominion is a lesser dominion, and it is representing the dominion of God on the earth. Interesting, there's been some recent study done on this whole issue of the image of God, and by looking at the ancient Near Eastern background, and the conclusion that scholars have come to is that is the main significance of the image of God, is that it is like it's like the idea of an icon, like a living statue. So in the ancient Near East, they had they erected these statues, obviously idolatrous, of their gods. And those statues were icons of God, representing the authority of God on earth. Well, the ancient Near Eastern world had the same idea about the human king. The Egyptian kings, for example, the pharaohs, they were one of the titles for them that we see in the second millennium BC is that the king is a living statue of the god. So the king is like a living icon, a living representation, reflecting God himself and reflecting his dominion on earth.
So that sounds a lot like the garbledness of the pagan world getting something about the biblical message right.
Yeah.
You definitely have that same image involved there, but they're confusing the creator and the creature. Right.
Yeah, the work that I'm referring to here is by Randall Garr, Garr, titled In His Own Image and Likeness, Humanity, Divinity, and Monotheism. It was published in 2003. And Randall Garr's book has been highly well received and highly regarded. And so his thinking there, which is really focused on the ancient Near Eastern context, really reinforces and supports what Kline is saying.
Okay, well, we'll definitely link to that in the show notes too.
Yeah, so there's some interesting quotes here, like here's an Akkadian text. This is from the time of Esarhaddon, so this is a little bit later. This is like the 700s or 600s BC, and this is a king referring to his father. He says, the father of the king, my lord, was the very image of the god Baal. Or another one, you, O king of the world, are an image of Marduk. Or another one, the king, the lord of the world, is the very image of the sun god.
Interesting.
Yeah. So man is like an image. He is like an icon of God on earth, representing the dominion of God and reflecting that divine counsel and the enthronement of God in the divine counsel, and reflecting that upon the earth in a visible way. And you see this, don't you, in Psalm 8?
Yes.
Kline appeals to Psalm 8, which, this is Kline's method, right? Where he's always going all over the place in the Bible, but there's a logic to it, because in Psalm 8, it's clearly reflecting Genesis 1:26. The language is almost identical. So you could say that Psalm 8 is a later biblical theological reflection on Genesis 1:26. So therefore we can look at the Bible's own interpretation. So when it says in Genesis 1:26, let them have dominion, Psalm 8 says, yet you have made him, man, a little lower than the heavenly beings. Oh, there's the divine counsel.
Right.
And crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea.
And what's interesting is I hear some Pauline language there describing Christ and how everything is going to be placed ultimately under him on the last day. And so
absolutely,
we're still seeing all of this DNA.
Yeah, because Christ is the second Adam.
Exactly.
So he too is going to, we can continue this inner biblical dialogue and see not only Psalm 8 reflecting on Genesis 1:26, but also, passages like Philippians 3:21, the power that enables him to subject all things to himself, 1 Corinthians 15, that he will bring all things in subjection. And then when all things are subjected to him, the Son himself will also be subject to him who put all things in subjection under him. And then Hebrews 2, which directly quotes Psalm 8 and applies it to Christ and his exaltation. But the Psalm 8 one is so interesting because it ties in this idea of man's dominion. It ties it in with the divine counsel.
Right.
Making him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowning him with glory and honor, and then placing all things under his feet. So you clearly see this idea that man's dominion over the world images the dominion of God enthroned in the divine counsel.
I think it's helpful to see the heavenly beings there in Psalm 8 as the divine counsel.
In Hebrew, it's Elohim. In Greek, the Septuagint, it's angels.
Interesting.
But it clearly has this idea of the fact that it refers to the Elohim clearly brings to mind this idea of God in the divine counsel, just like you see, for example, in the opening chapter of the book of Job, when the sons of God came and presented themselves before the Lord, and there's God amidst the divine council having a dialogue with one of the Elohim, Satan, about what to do about Job and so on.
So then from there, he also moves to talk about Genesis 3:22 and Adam's imaging of God in terms of knowing good and evil, which I hadn't thought much about when I took Pentateuch with Kline, but that that phrase, knowing good and evil, is simply another way of talking about dominion and judicial discernment. Mm-hmm. It's not that Adam had no idea what was good and what was evil, but that knowing good and evil was the, I guess, the judicial pronouncement that Adam would make as a representative of God. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, I think it's helpful to think of it this way. When it says in Genesis 3:22, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil," to sort of in your mind translate it as the man has become like one of us in having the ability to discern between good and evil.
Okay.
I think that kind of helps to bring out the meaning of it. And then Kline points to 1 Kings chapter 3, the whole passage about Solomon's wisdom, to show that this language of discerning between good and evil is a royal and judicial aspect. Because, of course, the story, Solomon prayed for the ability to discern between good and evil, and he prayed for that so that he would be able to be a wise leader, so that he would be able to govern and rule the people. And then, it goes on in 1 Kings 3 to give an illustration of that when you have the story of the two prostitutes who come before Solomon. And then after Solomon, in his amazing wisdom, he made the right determination of who was telling the truth. It says in verse 28, "All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice." So what Kline's point is that this is a royal judicial function. This ability to discern between good and evil, it's not just, some sort of generic wisdom or just being smart. It's actually a judicial function.
Yeah, I was going to point out that it's important that it's Solomon, because Solomon's the king of Israel.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some respected guy in Israel.
Right.
It was the king.
He's the king. And so he's an Adamic figure. Mm-hmm. And don't forget all the Adamic themes and motifs in that section of 1 Kings, all about how he, his wisdom and his exploration of creation, and all that language there, which is harking back to creation. The fact that he even, builds the temple, and the references to the palm trees and the pomegranates and all that woven into the fabric and even into the architecture of the temple. All of that is telling you Solomon is the second Adam here.
Exactly.
So
I continue to be struck as I read the Old Testament by the language that's used to describe the land of Canaan that is completely reminiscent of the garden.
Yeah. A land flowing with milk and honey, a very fruitful land. It's well watered. It has a river going through it, just like the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. There's a mountain in the center of it, just like in the Garden of Eden, which we know from Ezekiel 26, which mentions the mountain of God, but also the fact that the rivers are flowing down, and you can't have that unless there's some sort of elevation. So there must be a mountain there, which is parallel to Mount Zion. All right, so you have Genesis. We're looking at all the elements in the Genesis account that bring out the royal judicial aspect of the image of God. We've seen Genesis 1:26, let them have dominion. Psalm 8, which reflects on that. Genesis 3:22, knowing good and evil. Another one, it's not in the creation account itself, but a little bit later, but obviously reflecting it, is Genesis 9 and verses 5 and 6. This is after the flood, and God is reinstituting common grace on a covenantal footing, and he says to Noah that he's going to require a reckoning from every beast and from every man that sheds blood. And then he says, verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And Kline here has an interesting interpretation of this that might differ from what most of us have been taught. I think most of us have been taught that the statement for God made man in his own image is given to justify the preciousness of human life. And so that's why murderers have to be given capital punishment, because they're taking the life of someone who's made in the image of God. But Kline takes it differently. He says that the for clause explains the reason why man is authorized to inflict capital punishment.
Interesting.
So when it says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. That phrase, by man, is the part that's being justified here with the for clause. The reason that man has the authority to put murderers to death is because man is also like God, and has that godlike authority to exercise judicial discernment and to exercise justice in a godlike way.
Interesting. So the image of God justifies man having that judicial authority to execute capital punishment. And I mean, could we say that secondarily, or kind of an implication would be that human life is precious, or would Kline not even want to see that in this particular text?
That's a good question. Maybe I think that's a possibility, but I don't think it's what Kline said.
I mean,
yeah,
you're right. Kline didn't say it, but I guess maybe we could tease it out a little bit in the sense that, there's nothing in Genesis 9:6 about executing animals for doing something wrong. So there is something about the image of God that makes us even worthy of capital punishment.
Yeah, could be. Although it does say, in Genesis 9:5 that he's going to require a reckoning even from every beast. And in the Mosaic law, the ox that gores, if it's not properly dealt with, can be put to death too. So I don't know.
Well, I could be wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so to sort of sum up this section B on the glory of the image of God, we know that because man was made in the image of God, man was also the ruler on earth under God. And we know that human beings possessed the ethical glory of, at least before the fall, unconfirmed righteousness, with that hope of moving beyond probation into the glory of that confirmed righteousness.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we're at the top of page 45 here. This is hinting at something that Kline's going to get at later as we get into the covenant of works in subsequent chapters, I think chapter 3 and 4. But he says something really interesting here. He says, as image of God, man also possessed the ethical glory of a state of simple righteousness, with the prospect of moving on to the greater glory of confirmed righteousness. That's an interesting distinction between simple and confirmed righteousness.
Right.
I mean, we'll have to wait to see how he fleshes that out later, but that really struck me when I saw that. Man, of course, was created innocent, and he did not have sin as he was created. And yet, the righteousness that he had at creation prior to the probation was not quite the same righteousness that he really needed, which is confirmation in righteousness, a righteous status that says you are not only innocent, but you are declared righteous and imputed with righteousness so that you can be worthy of entering the eschatological glory. So in other words, he had to accomplish something. He couldn't just be born innocent. He had to accomplish something, accomplish righteousness, and then be confirmed in that righteousness in order to attain the eschatological advancement that was held out under the probation of the covenant of works.
I guess I'm hearing in the phrase confirmed righteousness an aspect of the next point that Kline talks about, that Adam and Eve were given a hope of eschatological glorification, that confirmed righteousness is immutable. That once Adam and Eve would be confirmed in righteousness, they couldn't lose that anymore. Right.
Yeah, that's good. There would be beyond probation at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yes, it would be a declaration, but it would also be ontological. It would be part of their being in a way that they could not otherwise be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so that next sentence is very good. I love this sentence. And a further promise of man's image status was that of transformation into the likeness of the epiphanic light.
I got to turn there really quickly. Is there a hyphen there?
No.
Oh.
Epiphanic is just a regular old adjective. He could have said the epiphanic glory light. If you want to put a hyphen in there.
I just wondered because in that first very poetic quote that you read at the beginning of the episode, I counted 4 hyphenated phrases in there. But
indeed. I know. It's great. And then the next sentence is, man was given the hope of an eschatological glorification that would change him into a transfigured glory image of the radiant glory spirit. I think that what's really exciting about all this is just understanding this idea of prospect and hope, you know?
Right.
That's all there. I mean, when God creates man, when we're just looking at the first 2 chapters of Genesis before we get to the probation and the fall and all that, everything is just so expectant, you know? There's so much hope and expectation here. There's prospects. There's things to come that are all implied in Genesis 1 and 2.
Yes.
The hope of being confirmed in righteousness, the hope of being transformed into that eschatological glory image. There's such a freshness and a straining of the neck to see what's going to happen next. Of course, it all comes crashing down, but you know, when Adam sins, but that hope, that freshness, that spring-like feeling, you know, there's just something great about to happen. And that's all implied in the image of God. And that's why Kline is so insistent on saying that the covenant of works that God made with Adam, while it had to, you know, be given some specific verbal revelation in terms of the prohibition of the tree and so on, nevertheless, the fundamental eschatological hope contained within the covenant of works was something that was built in to man's creation in the image of God from the very get-go. Because the image of God itself contains this eschatological hope within it.
Amen. And I find that so much more exciting than, I guess, the only other thing that I know of as an alternative, which is just that God created Adam and Eve to just live there, and it could have just been that way forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah, it could have been that way forever, and at any moment Adam could sin and lose it all, and just being forever on probation, but with no hope, with no possibility of any kind of a probation mechanism that would enable him to move beyond that to a confirmed status.
Right.
That doesn't seem just. It doesn't seem good. It doesn't seem to really reckon with the fact that man is made in the image of God. If you really think about what that means, that he is made in the image of God, then it has to have some kind of an eschatological hope to it,
right?
Of fulfilling that image, of achieving what the image is supposed to be.
So helpful. And I like that you brought justice into that. I mean, it would not be just of God to create someone in his image to reflect his glory, to reflect his dominion, if there was no expectant hope of that coming to fruition in a consummated new heavens and new earth.
Right.
So, and participating in that consummated new heavens and new earth with God as a creature that, I just go back to that confirmed righteousness that has all of the creaturely glory of the glory spirit in a way that can't be lost anymore.
Yeah. And another way you could tie it together would be to use the word communion.
Right.
Because obviously man is made for union and communion with God. But what kind of union and communion is it if it's just always up in the air and it's not certain and it's not confirmed? It's just, you're always on the edge of your seat, and at any moment, something could go wrong and you could fall from that. That's not really union and communion, right?
Right.
So the very fact that man is made for union and communion with God means that there's got to be some way for him to have that advancement, to be able to truly enjoy that communion and union. He needs to have confirmation.
That's so true. Almost like, now, not assurance of salvation, but it's almost like we're talking about some sort of assurance that Adam and Eve would have had even in their pre-fall state.
Yeah, just like with all of these things, we're talking about a pre-redemptive concept that is parallel to that,
Mm-hmm.
So, just like Kline will often talk about the New Jerusalem and use that as the redemptive version of Metapolis, but then we can kind of use that to think back and say, well, what was the pre-redemptive version of it? We could do the same thing with assurance. We think of assurance purely in redemptive terms, as salvation from sin, and the assurance of that, and the assurance that our sins are forgiven and that we are adopted as God's children. So that's the redemptive version, but there's got to be a pre-redemptive version as well that could have been a reality had Adam passed the probation. Amen.
Well, I think that might actually be a good spot to pause on, because we're coming right up to another section, image of God and Son of God. So we'll pick up there next week.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lee. I really appreciated that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciated it too.
All right, everyone. Please do head on over to the Meredith Kline Facebook page and let us know what you think about this. And we will see you next week.